is called the Tree of Life. The site I'm going to talk about is called the Tree of Life, and it has this wonderful, wonderful animation where you can see the entire Tree of Life. So this is the starting page for the site, the Tree of Life, and it's a very good place to go and explore the classification of organisms. Here it's zoomed all out. We have bacteria, and then over here we have all the stuff that we usually look at in discovery programs. So let's zoom in a little bit here. And the elegant thing is you just zoom and zoom and zoom, and then we have ending up with all the different groups. Now we're in eukaryotes here. The difference between eukaryotes and prokaryotes being that eukaryotes have a cell core, prokaryotes don't. And we can keep zooming in, and we have to get really far in before we get to animals. So all the animals, that is the stuff you usually look at, is actually a quite small part of our entire Tree of Life. But let's keep zooming in. Being a little egocentric, we might want to go in and find, ourselves. Here we are, zoomed in the Tree of Life at us, ourselves. We always like to talk about ourselves. So here we have Homo sapiens. Homo sapiens being the binomial name. And just remember that all names in science are given in Latin. And we also always have two parts, the genus, Homo, and the species sapiens. So here we have Homo sapiens. But what makes the Tree of Life interesting is that we can zoom in and out. So here we have all our other common family members. We have the chimpanzees, we have the gorillas, the two different species of gorillas, and then we can zoom out. All right. So we have the orangutan, which means this is the group that all the big monkeys come from, and we can keep zooming out. Then we have other species of monkeys, and if you want to go in and look at them, well, you can zoom in there and find what other species you can find here. So let's talk about classification. In biology, we use a system that makes it easy for us to classify living organisms. Now, this might look simple, but in reality, stuff like this is shuffled and reshuffled every decade or two when new technology, when new knowledge changes how we see the different animals, where they belong and who they are related to. A lot of this work started with Carl von Linné, the Swedish scientist, who came up with this system that you should organize living organisms, and you should organize them so you can see who they are related to. And this gives us this hierarchy here, where we start with the biggest group. For example, here we have the shark, here are the species, but we start with the biggest group called the domain, which are the eukaryotes. And from the domain we go into the kingdom, here are animals, then we go into phylum, class, order, family, and then here in the end, genus and species. And genus and species are the two things we need to form the organism's binomial name. And binomial names are in Latin, the genus and the species. And the smart thing about that is we can all agree. For example, no matter where in the world you are, Canis lupus is the common wolf, the gray wolf. So, and Canis familiaris is the domestic dog. So we have these names that will put all organisms into here, and from here you can work back to see where they are, and that is exactly what we just did when we played around in the Tree of Life. So in 4.2 in the syllabus we start looking at different marine organisms. Just be aware that marine joke, we are just scratching the surface of the ocean here, because there are so many different organisms living in the ocean that just touching on them in a class like this is an immense subject. This is a reason why people go to university for many years to learn marine science. But here we're going to look at some of the different key organisms, and the most important one for all reasons are the phytoplankton. The phytoplankton is our primary producers in the ocean. Yes, I know we also have macroalgae and seagrass, but the most important primary producer is our phytoplankton. And planktonic means that it's an organism who floats in the water. They can't swim themselves, they're too small, they just drift with the currents, with the waves, and they tend to live primarily in the upper 30 to 40 meters of the ocean, where we have enough light for photosynthesis. And we look at two different types of phytoplankton here in the chapter, the diatoms and the dinoflagellates. But in general, we can look at plankton at the size of plankton. We'll look at zooplankton later, but picoplankton, nanoplankton, and microplankton is on how small they are. We also have what we call macroalgae, which we'll talk about later, which are organisms which are much larger. Now, here just look at two examples of phytoplankton. If you want to learn more about different parts, please go in at the Tree of Life and have a look. But diatoms and dinoflagellates, they are similar in many ways, that they are unicellular. It means it's just one cell. The entire organism is just one cell, which is one of the reasons why they are so small. That also gives both of them a very fast reproduction time. When there is light, when there is nutrients, the amount of algae, phytoplankton, can grow really, really fast. Diatoms have cell walls made of silica, which give them unique and often very beautiful shapes, while dinoflagellates have their cell walls made of different things. But again, both of them have a very fast reproduction rate, and especially for the dinoflagellates, they can be toxic, and they can lead to harmful algae blooms, where the different toxics that they release is accumulated, especially in shellfish and mussels, and that is why every year some people get sick from eating mussels that has been contaminated with toxic algae. Both groups here, they tend to be eaten very quickly by our primary consumers, which means they are the start of all the food chains in the ocean. Yes, I am aware that we have a different food chain around the hydrothermal vents, but in general, phytoplankton will start our food chain. This is where the carbon gets fixated, and we start something that all the different consumers can eat of. So without phytoplankton, no life in the ocean. Also, a lot of the oxygen we breathe is being released by the phytoplankton when they do photosynthesis. So although they are small and single cell, they are extremely important to life in the ocean and life in general at our planet. So never underestimate the awesomeness of phytoplankton. The other planktonic group we talk about here is zooplankton, and zooplankton is, from a scientific point of view, a quite diverse group, and it's a group where we throw in everything that is not phytoplankton, but is still at a planktonic state, which means they can't really swim, they just float around with the currents. And the interesting part here is we have animals who spend their entire life as zooplankton, and other animals which is a part of their life is in the planktonic phase. So for example, copepods, jellyfish and krill, they are like plankton for life, which means they float around and then they eat smaller animals and they eat phytoplankton. So in our food chain we have the light, which gives us phytoplankton. Which then get eaten by the zooplankton. So, for example, the krill, the jellyfish, the copepods, they are in this phase for their entire life, while many other marine animals have a larvae state. which means that when they're small, they're larvae and they just float around the currents, but when they get bigger, they will change. So for example, many fish, when the fish eggs hatch, they are larvae and they float around, but eventually they get big enough to swim themselves. Blue mussels, other mussels have a larvae state where they float around until they find a place to settle, and then they grow into just staying at one place for the rest of their existence. So this is zooplankton, is just this huge bucket. We throw in all the different organisms who float around and tend to eat either phytoplankton or other smaller zooplanktons. But again, for the food chains in the ocean, these are super important, both because they provide food larger up the food chain. For example, krill is a major food source for whales, but also because many important marine organisms are in the zooplanktonic phase before they grow big enough to become active predators themselves. So one of the ways we use to separate organisms from each other in science is what we call the Optimus Keys. This one here is hyper simplified, and today we also use many other techniques, DNA being one of the more important. So we don't just look at the morphology, but also at the genetic makeup. But here we have just a very short version of a key of what can be found walking around in my biology lab. So the idea is you have a choice, and each choice will lead you to a new path. So here we can either have, does the organism have legs or no legs? So we say, okay, it has legs, then we go to section 2. In section 2 we have two options. Does it have 2 legs or 4 legs? 2 legs, it's me, Homo sapiens. 4 legs, it's a dog, Canis familiaris. We can also say it has no legs, and then we go to 3 here, okay? Then we ask if it's an aquatic animal or a terrestrial animal. And if it's aquatic, we go to 5. Does it have fins? It's one of the fish in the aquarium. If it has an outer shell, it's one of our swimming turtles. And the same if we say, is it terrestrial? Okay. Does it have scaly skin? It's one of our snakes. Does it have slimy skin? It's our single snail. This, of course, being just a very easy and superficial version of it. I will post links in the end of the video to a video where I go into much more detail about how to use these keys. But the idea is you always have 2 choices. We can go this way or that way in the key, and hopefully if you do it correctly, we'll end up with the right name, Homo sapiens, Canis familiaris, or so on.